It also looks warm. I've got my jacket on because I'm at Starbucks, experiencing the fall, the fall weather. Yes.
When do you leave to go back down? And were you lucky you were up here?
Well, yes, in a way, and yes. Well, I would have been lucky anyway because that whole storm went south, and really, St. Pete was pretty unscathed mostly. I mean, there's some power outages, but nothing like what went down in further south there.
Yeah, I have a friend.
Yeah, so
we're starting live stream right now,
Mhm.
so that's working.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. And then I think I'm going to start recording to my computer and make sure it's ready. And then I think Stephen is going to be ready to introduce Eric. Continue. All right, 1 minute. And I'm going to highlight, spotlight Stephen. Spotlight. All right. 7 o'clock. Go ahead, Stephen, you're on.
Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight we have a speaker for you for Peace Action Maine. We're happy to have Eric Erdstrom, who is a former captain in the U.S. Army with us. He's written a book called "On American: A Soldier's Reckoning of our Longest War." Has some very intimate insights from his perspective in both entering and having his perspective challenged and changed as he served our country. I've been impressed so far by reading it, and that it not only gives a window of a soldier, but also different quotes over time and different people who are probably watching the war from a distance, and what that is like, how it affects a person who's serving the country over there, what his emotional situation was like. The other thing that's really important about this, I think, is that he's helping really to bridge something which Peace Action's been interested in for quite a while now, and that is the connection between the militarism and the climate. And that's just something which is, it's kind of like a gaping hole in our consciousness. In any case, we're happy to have him here tonight. And I guess I will let him get started. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you, Martha. And hello, Peace Action Maine. I feel like sort of the beginning of a rock show or something like that at a concert. It's really good to be sharing some time with you, and I'm really honored and grateful to have been asked and to hear that the things I wrote about over many years to put together a book caught the attention of some people from this group, and they thought enough of it to ask me to speak. So it's one of the great joys of being an author to know that something you wrote touched people in a way that matters, and it brings me a lot of joy to know that. And it's obviously an extremely tough topic. It's not the most lighthearted material. I don't think anyone says that by picking up Un-American or Passive Dissent, which is another book published this year that I co-authored the first, I authored the first chapter, and I was one of about a dozen veterans to pitch in for that book. But these are tough conversations to have. And for many who are less familiar with sort of the points of view that we provide, it's probably very confronting. And some folks, are sharing anecdotes from their lives about some of the worst days that they've ever experienced. So maybe I'll just start out by sort of elaborating a bit more on some of this background of who's this person sitting here, what was my journey to sort of shift from military to studying climate science, and how have I tried to participate in putting a voice out there on this nexus or intersection between militarism and climate specifically. So as Stephen was mentioning, I went to West Point, but I grew up in Massachusetts, so not too far away from all of you, and certainly remember my childhood vacations of going up to Bar Harbor, Maine, or Bangor, or was it Cadillac Mountain, I recall climbing as a kid. Oh, Martha's giving big thumbs up. So like, certainly spent a decent amount of at least summertime as a child in Maine. And, from the age of 17, I joined the military. I graduated high school in 2003, which is about as jingoistic or nationalistic a time as you could be in terms of blind faith and nationalism in recent American history. And, at that age, I knew a few things. Number one, I knew I couldn't pay for college and that my family didn't have money for me to attend college on their dime. So I was gonna have to find my own way. Number two, I sort of believed that military service is an absolute good. You're raised as a child on a diet of stories that the US, no matter what they do, it's always a good thing to serve. Only later, as I learned, it's not true, and that it's actually extremely patriotic to question that premise about military service being an absolute good. And one of the analogies that I often use that seems to resonate with folks is that no other public service career would have the same sort of effects, in the sense that if you devoted your life to being a teacher and you became better at teaching, you could go to sleep fairly soundly knowing that the community and the kids you teach are probably better off. The same thing could be said about being a firefighter. If you're really good at being a firefighter, presumably, things are better for your community. But being in the military, because it is not about construction or risk prevention, it is about destruction. It does not mean it's an absolute good to be serving in the military, because it highly depends on what the war is that you're going to go fight. And one of the main things in American culture is to push out of view any thoughts about what is the war that you're trying to fight. That you don't ask a lot of these questions that are upstream, saying, why are we doing this? How does this actually relate to defending Americans at home? What are going to be the externalities on the people that are living there? Is this morally justified? Is it justified in terms of international law? What sort of precedent ethically and morally do we set as a country? And what sort of impairments to our own national reputation globally might we have by intervening in a conflict? So those are all things that I never really was thinking about when I was 17 and thinking about joining the military. And, aside from the two things I just mentioned, three is I was athletic and really loved this idea of character building and personal development that you were not necessarily going to get taught formally as they do in a West Point curriculum at a civilian university. And so I applied and was very grateful to have gotten in. And my path sort of continued down that same route, that once you get to West Point, you start stacking yourself amongst your classmates, and the most American thing you can do, or the most not the most sexy thing you can do, but like the best thing that you could possibly do for service for your country, is to be as close to combat as possible. That it was almost seen as a scarlet letter or shirking your duty to be picking a support role, because you're in the back. The real Americans actually confront the enemies of America in close combat and fight them. And you don't see around West Point any buildings named after the supply and logistics officer. They are named after combatant commanders. No one in Signal is getting a statue or a time article written about them. It is about combatant commanders moving armor and infantry and field artillery units and aviation assets around the engagement area. So like it is culturally quite ingrained. And so for me as well, being the type A competitive person that I am, you know, pursued that route wholeheartedly. And I branched infantry. I went to Ranger School and reconnaissance school. I attended and passed Special Forces selection when I was 19. And I saw this life coming ahead of me of becoming one day, dreaming of being a detachment commander in the Green Berets and doing great work. And that's sort of what I saw. And in many ways, West Point's a bit insulated from that. In terms of sort of pedagogy, you are being taught by an older version of yourself, because the people who teach you are those that often graduated from West Point and lived a very siloed, channeled life where they did the same military training, they did the same military schoolings, they did the same deployments, they go to the same graduate schools, and then they come back and recycle those same thoughts at the academy over and over again. And so in many ways, one could say that that's in some ways brainwashing. And I had a very particular view of the world that was extremely positive about the use of political violence in other countries, and the belief that if I were guided by great values, I could do the right thing, that it doesn't matter what war you're in. If you as an individual are leading you know, on a moral compass that points to true north, that your service is good. And I believed that, at least until I got to Afghanistan. And so my time proceeded where, you know, I became a platoon leader in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where about 25% of my platoon I originally deployed with became casualties during that year-long deployment. And they became casualties in lots of different ways. I did not make it through the first week of my tour in Kandahar before a vehicle was hit by a anti-personnel mine linked to homemade explosives, and it completely ripped apart my squad leader's vehicle, tossed the engine block, you know, quite far away, tires going 100 meters away, and we're evacuating 4 of my soldiers before the outgoing unit had even left. And so you think about it and you realize, okay, this is 1 week down and I've lost 4 guys that are now injured and out of the tour. I didn't know how seriously injured they were and whether they would be permanently handicapped, whether they would have traumatic brain injuries. And so I was unclear like what this year was going to look like. If that's 1 week down, that is a pretty ominous view. And so throughout that deployment, I started to realize, as the US was shooting a school, not a school bus, but basically a passenger bus full of machine gun rounds by the Arkansas National Guard, because they were driving too close to the US convoy, and the presumably very frightened 19-year-old private or whoever is in the back of the convoy feels threatened, and they shoot this bus up, killing, you know, something like 3 or 5 people and injuring double digits of others. You could understand the legitimate grievances and anger that Afghans had for us being in their country. And I knew after a certain amount of time that no matter what I did as an individual, I was an occupier. And that the things that our country was doing to the people of Afghanistan is unquestionably state terrorism. Because if you did the same thing to us, if you had a drone strike hit a wedding in Maine, what would you call it? By a foreign country or maybe a group? Well, it would probably be considered terrorism. If they were targeting, you know, people in the CIA, the FBI, and the military, and maybe policymakers who were voting the wrong way that they didn't like, and they're being targeted for assassination either by drone or by raids, we would probably call it terrorism. if Americans were being held in black sites for being tortured or held in a Guantanamo equivalent, we would probably call that terrorism. But we do that to other countries, and we are willing to destroy far more for far less as a country. And so I started to realize that while I was there, and it was a pretty rude awakening. And about 9 months in, I received my sort of email from like basically the Special Forces branch in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, saying, hey, your packet's been accepted. You've already gone through selection. When you finish this deployment, you'll report down back to Fort Bragg. You'll no longer be classified as an infantry officer, and you can begin the rest of the Q course. And to me, this was the dream I had for many years. This was the culmination of many years of hard work at West Point and chasing a dream that others thought was right, and that I thought was right for quite a long time. And having seen what I saw and witnessed in Afghanistan, it took me about 15 minutes to think about that and then respond quite curtly that this is something I'm no longer interested in, and I'm looking to exit the military as soon as I possibly can when my contract is over. And so, I left the military in 2012 as a captain after being in the Honor Guard in DC. And I thought about what I wanted to do next. And, I had been, during that sort of period of time, I think it came out in 2006 or something, 2005, An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. And that was the first thing that got me thinking more seriously about what is this whole climate change thing? How serious is it? And, maybe I should devote some of my time, energy, and assets to learning more about this and having some sort of an impact. And I went to graduate school in the UK and did an MBA and also a Master of Science, where I studied climate change, specifically stranded assets, which are things that you could think of that suffer from a premature write-down or devaluation because the world doesn't understand climate change very well. At least certainly hasn't in the last several decades. And basically, like, things that are at much greater risk than we may think, or what would be popularly considered risky. And from that point, I worked in the private sector in consulting and spent a lot of time thinking about my experience in Afghanistan, and I knew I wanted to write about it. And I knew that I wanted to have a climate lens in the book. The editors and the publishing house wasn't actually sure whether that was a good idea. And, is this a book about a soldier's experience in war and sort of having a first person primary source perspective on what it is to be in combat? Or is this about policy and lots of other stuff? And I felt that I wanted to make a very conscious decision in writing that book, that I didn't want to say that the war is wrong, immoral, and a huge waste of our country's assets and devastating to the people of Afghanistan. I also wanted to take a stand on and say and take a perspective on what we should be focusing on instead. And so I put a lens looking at the climate crisis. And so I'll read just a couple paragraphs from that excerpt from the book, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the article that I penned with Colonel Larry Wilkerson and retired Major General Dennis Leitch earlier this spring, and sort of what I mean by climate action as patriotism. So here it goes. Since the Industrial Revolution, the United States is the world's leading contributor to climate change, emitting more carbon dioxide than the next 3 countries combined: China, Russia, and Germany. This measure of total emissions, rather than only looking at present day emissions, is the measure to use when allocating culpability, because gases like carbon dioxide do not dissipate for thousands of years. On the topic of climate change, the United States has demonstrated willful ignorance and active resistance leaving a soiled legacy for future generations. Our government's response to the climate crisis amounts to environmental blitzkrieg waged against those least capable of defending themselves, other species, the poor, and unborn generations. Although American citizens may not expect perfection from our political leaders, we do expect a level of stewardship greater than complete and utter incompetence. Unfortunately, US policymakers cannot clear this low bar on the urgent topic of climate. The Climate Change Performance Index, compiled by the Climate Action Network, ranks countries for their actions on climate change, including their climate policies, energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions. Of the 60 countries measured, the United States and Saudi Arabia are 59th and 60th, respectively, on the list. As such, the effects of climate change continue to worsen. Leading organizations have become more urgent in their warnings. It makes you wonder, is there a worse crime? A worse crime than willfully and deliberately undermining organized life on this planet? And make no mistake, every dollar that America invests in war today is not only a dollar not spent on addressing the direct causes of climate change, but a reinvestment in more and worse wars in the future caused by climate change. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, quote, climate change sows seeds for conflict, but it also makes displacement much worse when it happens. In 2015, the DoD wrote a paper about climate-related security risks, stating that it, quote, recognizes the reality of climate change and the significant risk it poses to US interests globally. The report went on to note that the impacts are already occurring and projected to increase over time. Climate change will, quote, aggravate existing problems such as poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions that threaten domestic stability in a number of countries. The message that America needs to take away is that investing in climate change is an investment in national security. If unity can only be achieved by waging war, then let America have a war against global warming. It continues, and that was sort of something I wanted to talk about with other leaders from the military that could offer this unique perspective. And so I reached out to Colonel Wilkerson and Major General Leitch, asking them if they wanted to co-write a piece with me on this. And I wanted to get them on the byline as senior military officials who also have a perspective on this. And so we wrote that piece that was published in Yale Climate Connection back in April. And the notion is that climate action groups have not been wildly effective at getting the sort of climate lukewarmers of the world worried or concerned sufficiently relative to the amount of risk that we're facing. And I realized that when I talk about this with other people, and I talk about this in sort of the other peace action groups as well, a lot of groups want to focus on downstream policy solutions rather than just the upstream problem. And this is something we're working on with the Eisenhower Media Network. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people on the political spectrum can agree that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq have been failed. They could agree that they've been extremely expensive, that they haven't produced any tangible results and that they're actually a net negative. The more we invest, the more is lost. But the problem is that once you go to the next step of where we might put that money instead, there's revolution, because lots of folks disagree. Some might say it should be tax cuts. Some others would say investment in something else, government programs. And so if we start dividing our voice by going further and further to offering solutions rather than just agreeing on the problem and get majority voice on the problem, we can fight those second policy battles later. But we can't even address them if we're doing it in a fragmented manner. where everyone is suggesting different ideas for what should be done instead. We need a group around the main problem to go downstream. And I brainstormed this with Major General H and Colonel Wilkerson. And I mean, my take on this is that climate change as an issue can be spun lots of different ways. You're hurting your children and grandchildren. 50% of vertebrate species and biodiversity loss will be extinct by the end of the century. You know, there will be more natural disasters and superstorms. Those things are maybe compelling to a certain group of people, but there is still a group of people that is resistant to accepting that climate change is real. It is happening. It's happening now, and it needs to be addressed more as seriously as a mobilization for World War II, effectively. And my approach is to try to change the narrative around climate change in the military specifically. You can, there's no doubt, like we can talk about the military as being one of the leading polluters of the world. That's uncontroversial. There's plenty of data to, you know, point the finger at the military and wag it and say, you're very bad, you're a very large polluter, and the United States as a country is obviously cumulatively, and this was a point I was making in the book, because yes, today in 2022 figures, in absolute terms, China has more emissions than we do, but the thing that matters is the cumulative. Scientifically, cumulative matters because carbon emissions are trapped in the atmosphere for thousands of years and they don't dissipate. So you, rather than measuring just this year, you want size under the curve of every year since the Industrial Revolution. And that's how you attribute responsibility and accountability. And the US is by far, by a country mile, the largest polluter. But when it comes to trying to activate that group, that resistant group that doesn't want to talk about the climate crisis as a national security threat, we wanted to reframe it as it actually is extremely patriotic to take climate action. It is extremely patriotic to address this problem. And we do it in the sense of like, you're basically screwing the soldiers if you do not, because you do not want to try to provide national security in a 3-degree world. Providing national security in a 3-degree world would be far more expensive for the country. So again, removing all emotion, just talking in dollars and cents, it would be a lot harder to do it in a 3 or 4-degree world. There would be more conflict, and if the US is trying to be involved in these conflicts, there would be more of them, and more American children would be deployed for longer periods of time to more unstable environments. And so maybe that is an argument that could resonate with folks. Maybe an argument that it is a threat to our national security for physical bases. That if there's another climate book that came out called When All Hell Breaks Loose, it came out in 2020 as well. And that was about climate change in the military. And they talk a lot about sort of the risks posed to military infrastructure. And that would be sort of flooding of Air Force bases or naval bases, storms that would interrupt operations and service, all of these sorts of things. So basically sort of expanding on that point as well, that if you want to keep a strong America in terms of defense of the national territory, that it is good to invest in climate change because these are going to affect our military preparedness. And so it's sort of taking a technocratic, like emotional appeal. So technocratic in the sense of like, this is affecting our preparedness as a military and as a country to defend itself, but also the emotional appeal of if in this world with greater warming, more American soldiers will be sent to war. Do we want that as a country? And so that was trying to flip the narrative and try to use that as a tool to sort of help encourage people to think about climate change and militarism in a different way. So that's sort of the main point I wanted to get across with that article. I'm trying to think, just quickly check if there's anything else that I wanted to capture. Yeah, I mean, basically, the one other quote that I had from my book, which summarizes some of my thinking, is that if the military is so myopic that it's only focusing on combat readiness and not climate change, and although they're sort of connected, it doesn't make much sense, because how can you possibly keep the world safe for democracy or keep America safe in a more narrow ambit if you're not willing to do what is required to keep the world safe for life on it? And that requires immediate action. And so that's the pitch. Happy to hear feedback from all of you. It looks like there's some comments in the chat, and I've been going for about a half hour, so let me pause so I don't sound like a big windbag.
Lonnie had a question, I think, and so did Fred. Lonnie, I don't see, and John does too. Okay, let's do, Fred had a pretty straightforward one that about what a 3 degrees world is.
So I mean, 3 degrees C is what we'd be referring to. So that would be 3 degrees centigrade. I don't know exactly what the conversion is. It's probably like 4.5 or something like that Fahrenheit. A 3 degrees C world rise above industrial revolution temperatures. So it would be basically, if we raise global temperatures on average by 3 degrees C, what would the world look like? And basically, I mean, I don't have the full list of what those effects and implications are right in front of me, but it's effectively with each degree above 2, you get increasingly bad circles of hell, to be frank. So it is about the extreme biodiversity loss, where large groups of species can become extinct. You can have issues as well, like there's a lot of wild effects when you study this, about like trophic cascades, for instance. So one in the food chain, one animal is particularly affected by climate change and is wiped out. Well, that species fed the next species down, and so they don't have anything to eat because that species is gone. So they die out, and then the next one dies out, and then the next one dies out, and that's the trophic cascade that's referred to. There's also like a lot of other wild nightmarish effects. If you think of sort of the thermohaline circulation of ocean currents. So you have hot and cold currents going around the globe that keep different geographies warmer or cooler. For instance, if you melt down Greenland and you dump a bunch of cold, fresh water into a current, which is warm, going around England and parts of Europe, that it basically stops, because you'll have cold on bottom and cold on top from the melting ice. And you basically disable the water from churning to create those warm waters elsewhere. So you can create, downstream effects elsewhere. It's also about sort of the volatility. So like not all parts of the world will experience climate change the same way. As I understand it, like Caribbean countries are going to be far less affected than the Nordics, for instance. So yes, when you talk about 3 degrees C, you might be talking about 9 degrees C in northern Sweden, but something not much more than 1 degree maybe in the Caribbean. So it's spread out differently in different parts of the world.
Then we've got Lonnie. Let me see if I can get down up on the screen to ask, because you had actually the first question. Go ahead. Let me see if I can find you, or just go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, well, what I was interested in is political action that you and others, like the military folks that you wrote your article with in April, are you taking any kind of political action? For example, I'm aware that the House in Congress has a group of representatives with military backgrounds that meet regularly. And I'm wondering if you've met with that group and tried to persuade them of your perspective and see what, kind of political action might come of it. Because it seems to me that there's got to be action at Congress, and you have a really persuasive story to tell. And there are plenty of people with military backgrounds in Congress. So it seems like an opportunity.
Okay, I was just going to say, I've got John and then Janet in the stack. Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, to answer your question, Lonnie, I mean, the short answer is no. I've not been invited by any congressional groups to talk about the issue from a military and climate perspective. I think Colonel Wilkerson has been involved in different groups, and maybe it's just that they're more interested in more senior brass than a mid-level captain to be participating in these conversations. So I have not been on the Hill to talk to people and try to push this perspective. My angle is I occasionally write about it and speak about it, but no, haven't been involved in Washington. I see.
John Raby?
Yes, ma'am. Eric, first of all, thanks for coming. I have two short stories to tell you based on the observation that as a culture, the United States is very deeply military industrialized. And my central question is, how do we decouple the public from its current military industrial mentality so that it can take effective political action to improve things? Now, here are the two incidents I'm going to recite. I went to Stanford, which came east in 2013 to Michie Stadium. So here we go. I thought you'd like that. Anyway, during the halftime show, a bunch of military industrial executives trotted out onto the football field, and sprinkled among them were several West Point graduates who'd been senior officers. And they showed a video of military industrial equipment crushing every obstacle in sight. And then after the video was through, these guys turned to the Corps of Cadets and said quite openly, play your cards right. And at the end of your hitch, you can retire, join us, and get rich. The crowd loved it. Now let's fast forward to 2022. Top Gun Maverick. Okay, came out in the theaters in June. It's still packing them in. So I decided to see it, see how the message went, and see what the crowd reaction would be. In its basic terms, the message is war is glorious, and when Americans fight it, it's always good. The point I'm trying to make is that at the end of the film, the audience clapped and cheered. Now, this strikes me as limbic stuff. And so my question is, what do we do about it? How can the peace movement change the popular culture and decouple that mentality so that effective environmental and political action can follow?
John, you're asking like the $1 trillion question.
Well, we've got to get there and deal with it, I'm afraid.
No, I hear you. I unfortunately will probably have a very unsatisfying series of answers for that. I mean, I don't know how to do it. And I think that probably no one in this call knows how to do it, because if we did, it would have already have happened.
Gotcha.
That, I mean, when I wrote the lead chapter of the book Paths of Dissent, it is acknowledgement of collective failure of that we've been speaking about this for a long time. You've been speaking about it even longer. And yet it's so difficult to stop the Department of Defense budget from growing every single year by increments sometimes as large or larger than Russia's entire defense budget as a one-year incremental growth.
Right.
You know, so I think it's extremely challenging. I mean, like I don't have any silver bullets. I mean, I'm hoping that, you know, there will be other congressional representatives that have the courage to say, no, we need to cut this and rationalize what we're spending money on, because it's not an effective use of cash. And I mean, from sort of a cold, emotionless numbers perspective, just, articulating that this is not the threat, that, and I think America is slowly getting there, that, starting to realize that the Taliban boogeyman is a far smaller threat than climate change. So why are we spending $8 trillion fighting the Taliban boogeyman and spending, tens of billions of dollars, a small fraction to address climate change? That there's the weighting, the magnitude of the weighting of spend is so hilariously but tragically off that I think that people are slowly noticing this, but this isn't changing quickly. And I wish I had better answers other than continually trying to bang away in whatever way I can and appeal to as large an audience as possible. If I'm speaking to the progressive left, nobody gives a shit, because that's, a small, it's cool. Great. You're activating 10% of the voting base. Awesome. I mean, you need to activate more. So what is the argument that is going to hit moderates and hit Republicans and more centrist Democrats in a way that would change policy? And I think that's why I'm trying to find arguments that work. And I'm hoping that climate action as patriotism and putting the arguments forth is a positive message, as opposed to a negative message, which is finger wagging that the military uses more petroleum than 140 countries on Earth or whatever else. That doesn't move the needle. But saying that your children will go to more wars and we don't want to try to provide national security because it's so much more costly might work. But I wish I had better answers, John. You asked a good question.
May I suggest something? Maybe we need to demonstrate that we give a damn about working stiffs, like the guys who must have commanded, because they're a large slice of that 90% you're talking about.
Great, that's a good question. Janet, you're up next. Let me see if I can.
Okay, so I want to somewhat rephrase what I typed in the chat, Eric, but I am curious if you've read White Skin, Black Fuel, which examines the attachment of the right wing broadly construed, both in Europe, Brazil, and the US, and I think has a lot of great insights in it. But not sort of going that far to the right, but I think that understanding the appeal of everything from huge pickups to the idea of oil as underpinning both our national security and national identity might lead might give you some pathways into how to approach it with, as you're saying, this more, not the liberal left, but the, centrist to somewhat right wing. And also, I'd just like to make a comment that as a military family member who desperately tried to talk my nephew out of going into the Marine Officer Corps, I understand, and you know it better than I do, the great appeal of the military and the actual tangible, benefits of the military. And I think on the left that we have denied that in a way that has not served our causes.
Yeah, I mean, well, to answer your first question, Janet, I haven't read that book. To talk about the second comment, I think you're right. I think that almost everything is more complex and nuanced, and to absolutely pan military service, is not going to be something that will be well received by a lot of people. That maybe, I don't know if people crave for slightly more nuance than screaming on Fox News and screaming sometimes on MSNBC, that the outrage machine is exhausting. So saying it's not all bad actually serving in the military. It really isn't. But here are the things that are positive. They can let's have a look at those things. Which of these things can be acquired elsewhere? Can you acquire leadership skills in other professions? Can you have adventures with other people doing rough and tumble things and lots of hiking and physical stuff to make you feel active and alive? Sure. Are there ways to get health insurance that don't require you to go to war? And so like there's a lot there. And I generally advocate that if you adopt a tone of informed consent, almost like a medical doctor, saying like, here are the risks of undergoing this surgery, rather than saying like, no, don't do it, or absolutely do it, like more nuance around what that is. And again, the hardest thing to convey, because it doesn't fit in a bumper sticker, is like military service is entirely entwined with what we're doing with the military, what missions we're sending them on. I have absolutely no problem, and like maybe this is not with the ethos of some peace action groups, but I think that probably many believe in national security and defense of the homeland. I would have no problem going back to Boston and fighting an armed invader that's coming in on boats to take over America. Like, don't have a problem with war in the sense of defending a homeland against an aggressor, but that is not what we as a country do. And it is not what our military is trained to do anymore. We don't do missions protecting DC as practice. It's always some faux Middle Eastern village that is erected in Louisiana, that it's an offensive mission, not a defensive mission. So I mean, basically, I went a little bit off the rails there, but I hope that taking a tone of saying that there's actually some good to be had, that's okay. But like, here are the risks, and they don't outweigh the costs. Or sorry, the benefits don't outweigh the costs.
Great, thank you, Janet. Beth McCarthy is up next.
Yes.
You're in me. Great.
I also have my cat that just sat on my lap. So if you see a tail, it's not mine.
Go ahead, Beth, and then Lisa, and then Tim next in that line.
Oh, thank you. I had typed my questions in, and I think I got a few suggestions in the chat.
Can you also, sorry, I'm only seeing, oh, no, now I see it.
Yeah, I'm not on video, I'm on audio.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay. I got a few suggestions on the chat. I'm basically interested in not ownership, I'm sorry. Reading recommendations about, the impact of arms development and manufacture, and then of course the deployment on climate and environment. Because I just feel like there must be analyses of the cost of this and the impact. And, if you just look at I'm interested in what there is to read to inform myself better.
I don't read a ton of books on the military industrial complex. I read probably more news articles and like newspaper articles, and then also like magazine features, the odd one that comes out in the Atlantic or the New Yorker or the Economist or whatever it is. So generally, I think in that space, that's sort of what I've been reading. I mean, I've read a lot of other stuff that has larger narrative arcs about the role of military. I mean, Rachel Maddow's Drift, for instance, sort of talks about that as well. But I would say mostly for military industrial complex issues, again, I probably read mostly news. When it comes to climate change in the military, All Hell Breaking Loose is probably the most recent and all-encompassing book that like tackles that angle. it's honestly not the most exciting read, to be real with you. That's my perspective. And it's probably a lot of stuff that you have already had in your gut as knowing was true, but is elaborated quite a lot. Like, for instance, as we talked about, sort of cost to decarbonize the American military, impairments to military readiness due to extreme weather, flooding, and storms, increased costs associated with having to do more military operations because of food scarcity in other countries that then breaks out in civil war. And so it sort of explores all of those ways in which defense and climate overlap. But that's probably the best one I've found in that space.
Great. Lisa has a question that she actually mentions Andrew Basovich, who is the editor of the Paths of Defense that you wrote the lead chapter on. Lisa, can you unmute?
I would rather not, but if you insist, yes. I referenced Andrew Basovich's writings on not just the wasted military expenditures in Afghanistan, but in the 2 military actions in Iraq and in Bosnia, and basically he poses our wasted military expenditures since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, long before you were born.
Not long. I was born in 85.
Great. So I'm wondering if you're familiar with his writings and whether, I know that the military has been, as you mentioned, preparing for, strategies with regard to defensive approaches towards climate catastrophes and climate migration and et cetera, climate refugees and all of that. Is there anything happening internal to the military where people are saying, hey, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? Like, we can be more effective being proactive rather than being reactive here?
So there's, I think, widespread acknowledgement in the military based on what I've been reading. I mean, I left the military in 2012, so I'm not party to how brass talks about the topic day to day now. I mean, what I read from the Department of Defense when they publish reports, it's apropos that you asked, because before this I did a quick search to find out what the Department of Defense is saying. And here's the quote. This is published, DOD preparing for climate change impacts, officials say, June 15th, 2022, by a guy from DOD News. So, insider. And quote, climate change is dramatically increasing the demand for military operations and at the same time impacting our readiness and our ability to meet those demands while imposing unsustainable costs on the department, he said. To me, it's like, whenever I read anything about this, in the stages of action, the military is at stage awareness. Like, there is awareness and they've gone to acknowledgement. So it's not like, oh, climate change is an issue. They've proceeded at least to climate change is an issue and it's totally going to hit us pretty hard. I think in terms of like further downstream stages of like, and then spend a disproportionate amount of our budget actually refitting bases, decarbonizing our vehicle fleet. The military is a really slow moving thing. And if I were a military industrial complex executive, they have a perfect entry to spend, billions and billions of dollars for the future, because they'll say, we at Boeing and Lockheed Martin care about the environment. And that's why we are proposing a new fleet of vehicles, replacing the entire military fleet of vehicles that exist today, which are lower carbon. So please buy these instead. And that, I would imagine, is going to be the military's social impact approach to trying to address their own emissions internally. So obviously you can retrofit buildings, you can do microgrids to increase basically like protection for the base, in the sense that like if a large storm were to wipe out the grid, the microgrid with solar panels and whatever else could create energy locally, so that they would be insulated with battery storage and generation capacity to run the base basically without the grid. So there'll probably be billions of dollars spent buying a lot of microgrid and solar stuff, so that when increasing numbers of natural disasters happen, the military bases still operate. That's still not helpful for like the world in terms of like they don't have an answer for how they can possibly do 5 times as many military conflicts per annum, because climate change is creating civil war everywhere and food scarcity happens or water scarcity happens. I think that they're just completely unprepared for climate change, is my perspective in reading these quotes. They know it's a thing. They know it's going to hit them. They know they need to spend more money doing stuff. But the size of the tidal wave that's going to hit the military in terms of how much damage climate change will do in terms of military preparedness is like a tsunami. And so it's like, great, you're building sandcastles, you're building some local small walls to sort of protect the military, but that's not fixing the underlying issue. So, I mean, the government needs to do broader stuff, and that gets into a larger discussion about carbon taxes and whatever else, but I won't go down that.
Tim, Rosalie, and Glenn in the lineup. Go ahead, Tim. You're unmuted.
Hi, Eric. I'm a former combat arms officer also. I'm interested. So I'm looking forward to reading your book, but are you looking at, I mean, obviously foreign policy is the best way we can change the impact of our military on climate change, right? And so are you focused more there, or are you focused more on internally to the military, what they can do and what's within their control in changing it, or is it both focuses? And I guess within the military, what's the biggest area? I mean, besides our foreign policy, is it the manufacturing of all the equipment, or is it operations that is the biggest contributor?
It's a good question. I can answer the second one first, which is I don't actually have the sort of pie chart of effectively allocating emissions by type for the military. So I'm not entirely sure whether it's the manufacturing of aircraft versus base operations in foreign countries. I would imagine that like permanent bases in lots of different countries is a larger footprint than many of the others, because we're in something like, what is it, 80 odd countries? I think more than that. I'd have to look at, there's a Smithsonian Magazine article that talks about that. So I'm not entirely sure in terms of how to do allocation off the top of my head. For your first question about like what I'm focused on, it's both. I mean, the US as a country has a lot of work to do in terms of addressing its carbon footprint. And historically, the burden that America as a country has placed on the rest of the world proportionately for all of the emissions that are in the atmosphere today overwhelmingly falls on the shoulders of Americans. We've burned more and created more and have therefore a larger share of responsibility for the climate crisis than other countries because we're responsible for it. So I think that like addressing America at large and what we can do about it is more important than addressing the next level down, which is the military, which is also a very large emitter and the largest consumer of petroleum. It's one of the largest emitters globally, more than like domestic emissions for ExxonMobil and things like that. There's umpteen examples of how the military uses a tremendous amount of resources and burns a lot. So there's obviously both, and the military needs to figure out how they're going to reduce emissions. as you rightly called out, one of the best ways is to have fewer wars and to have fewer bases in foreign countries. But the real issue, again, is upstream. How can we address America as a country's emissions, and what are we going to do about it?
Great. I'm looking for Rosalie. She had a comment in the chat, but I don't see her here. So the next question is Glenn. Are you unmuted? There you are. Still not unmuted.
Yes. My question really stems from a meeting with Buckminster Fuller about 40 years ago when he wrote his book, Critical Path. And his basic premise was that we need to maintain terrestrial ecological integrity. While we're all dealing with the energy crisis, we're forgetting the most important and most significant aspect of all of it, which is the degradation of life in the biosphere. We're not paying attention or measuring any of this criteria. We're simply trying to maintain our lifestyles best we can. Does it make sense, in addition to your premise, Eric, about patriotism? And I'm a former combat veteran, so I've been working this agenda for at least 40 years. To try and change the social context with reward. And the reward must be economic and also social in its context. A way to decouple the worst part of a war culture is to create an additional culture that equals in all ways the nobility and the pride that we now focus in our war culture.
Understood.
Good question.
I mean, one thing to your comment, Glenn, I just pasted it in the chat. And I don't know how seriously the White House is taking this, but other measures aside from strictly gross domestic product, is this notion, and this is something that was talked about when I was at grad school in Oxford a decade ago, but like basically the natural capital, and it's to say like, trees, water, everything else that we exist on that underpins existence as humankind has value. We should try to do our best to measure that and ensure that each of those different sort of things that under the natural assets, are they growing or shrinking? And how much is climate change affecting each of those? And trying to basically create another index of well-being and health, in addition to just pure externality denying GDP.
Okay, I think we've reached the top of the hour. We had one quick question from Chuck. Charles Spanger, do you have a quick question?
Yes. What organizations, veteran organizations, do you think are doing good climate work now, and what would that work be?
It's a good question. I honestly couldn't tell you. I mean, I don't operate in the sort of veterans climate space day to day. I write articles and books and stuff, and I speak about it, but I'm not as aware of which 501c3 organizations are doing more or less formal or informal groups are really taking this seriously. I mean, yeah, I don't have a good answer, honestly. I mean, like I belong to About Face, which, sort of it talks about so Veterans Against the War and the aspects of climate. But I mean, there's lots of other sort of more think tanky and academic groups. Basevich's Quincy Institute writes a lot of white papers and sort of more academic type work, which gets quoted by things like the Washington Post. So their impact and their role is slightly different. Some take more like grassroots organizing approach to trying to share the message. Others try to influence the sort of the media to share that perspective. But I don't have a particularly good view on who's best these days.
And just a quick, Janet, do you have something to say about Veterans for Peace campaign or?
Well, I am discouraged that Eric has not mentioned Veterans for Peace.
Veterans for Peace, of course, too.
Militarism project. We have presented our slideshow, which we continually update, by the way. We presented that to now over 80 groups within the last 18 months. We have a deep website. We are doing these Stop the War, Save the Climate street actions. We're doing a lot. Webinars and so on. So
great. Thank you, Janet.
Yeah, and Janet, obviously I've talked at Veterans for Peace groups in the past. Are there other groups that you're thinking about as well, Janet? Because when I think about the space, there's a lot of different folks trying to work on the issue and to talk about it. I don't have some sort of rank order on who's most effective in generating change on the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it would be great to get some kind of conference of veterans organizations and get more post 9/11 veterans such as yourself involved. But I would say in terms of sustained ongoing public engagement, Veterans for Peace is, we're the ones doing it for right now. And I'm really hoping that at some point we can get veterans testifying to the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which is a committee that not a lot of people seem to even know exists, but really is important for shaping the discourse around the military greenwashing and other things that you have mentioned.
Great. Okay, so I promised Eric that he gets off at 8 o'clock and we've got 5 minutes over. Do you have any last minute comments before we close?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Janet, if you ever get that to happen where you've successfully negotiated to have veterans testify, keep me on the list, please. I would love.
Oh, you would definitely be at the top of the list. So thank you.
And I apologize for being remiss in mentioning Veterans for Peace straight away.
No worries. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining with us and sharing your thoughts. And I hope everyone, yes, if we can all kind of unmute and say thank you and wave or clap your hands or congratulate.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I took notes. I'm going to share them.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful that I was able to spend some time with all of you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Take care. Have a great night.
Okay,
Bye.
everyone,
Good night.
go ahead
Get a
and
chance,
leave.
look up Edward Cameron.
Go ahead and leave. It just takes me a while to shut down and I don't want to forget to copy the chat and that kind of stuff. So you're not rude. Just go ahead and leave. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Good night.
I want to copy down. Oh, shit. Where is my glasses?
He's probably arrested. I'm not sure.
He doesn't live in Maine.